Major powers relation and the South China Sea. This session will be moderated by Professor Vladimir MAZYRIN, Institute for Far Eastern Study, Russia. Our speaker is Professor Dong Wang from China, Mr. Gregory Poling from US, Professor KAZUHIKO Togo from Japan, Dr. Subhas Kapila, and Ms. Teresa Fallon from EIAS. Thank you.
When I look at the program, actually, I realize that our dear Vietnamese comrades have kindly put me as the first speaker of this panel, even ahead of our American colleague here. I very much appreciate that, but with Confucian modesty, I probably should defer to my American colleague, Greg, as a way to show that we really indeed do not want to challenge American hegemony in the region. But seriously, I think I was asked by the organizer to comment on the big power relations in South China Sea and provide a Chinese perspective. I assume that everyone has my printout paper, so I'm not going to simply read it out. Instead, I will take the opportunity to just make a brief comment, mostly, I think, focus on the United States and Japan's role in the South China Sea issue. First, the United States. Since U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton declared rhetorically on July 21st, 2009, that quote-unquote United States is back, the so-called U.S. returning to Asia, or pivot, or rebalancing, whatever label one uses, has become a very important backdrop against which a larger geostrategic game is unfolding. And South China Sea actually is part of that game. With unveiling of U.S. pivot or rebalancing to Asia, United States greatly reasserted its profile in South China Sea, and actually U.S. officials are very frank about the fact that they are doing so largely as a so-called pushback against the perceived assertiveness from China in South China Sea issue. And U.S. diplomatic and military moves are all familiar, including deployments of Marines to Darwin, Australia, asserting U.S. interests in freedom of navigation, boasting U.S. alliances with Japan, Australia, Philippines, enhancing security cooperation with Vietnam, India, improving relations with Myanmar, beefing up U.S. political missile defense system in East Asia, etc. Not surprisingly, U.S. heavy-handed moves generated suspicion, even resentment in China. Many Chinese analysts believe that the United States uses South China Sea as, quote-unquote, a strategic chip to balance, restrain, if not contain China. And consequently, the security dilemma between China and the United States was deepened. And in fact, toward the end of the first Obama administration, U.S. officials acknowledged that too much emphasis was initially put on the military and security aspect of U.S. rebalancing to Asia, and therefore must be recalibrated. And from the very beginning of the second Obama administration, U.S. senior officials, including National Security Advisor Donald Long and Assistant Secretary of State Dan Russell, all began emphasizing engagement with China is among one of the several pillars of U.S. rebalancing strategy to Asia. We may call it to rebalance the rebalancing strategy to Asia. Now, Chinese leaders has proposed building new type of great power relationship between United States and China as a vision and intellectual framework for avoiding the so-called Thucydides trap, or otherwise old patterns of great power conflict, and building a positive, robust, cooperative partnership between China and the United States down the road. Chinese President Xi Jinping and US President Obama actually had a very successful summit meeting at Sunnyland, California back in July, which has created what I call the Xi-Obama moment, analogous to the Mao-Nixon moment in the 1970s. Now the challenge is how to sustain such a momentum. Among many other things, I think both Washington and Beijing bear the responsibility for carefully managing sensitive issues such as territorial disputes, in the South China Sea, East China Sea, involving China and some of U.S. allies and partners. Miscalculation or wrong signals might not only disrupt U.S.-China relations, but also destabilize regional peace and stability. And I think the two sides must work together to draw a roadmap for building a new type of great power relations, one that transcends the logic of security dilemma, great power politics, one that makes the world a safer and better place to live. Now, I would like to move on to Japan, but before I start, I want to note that I'm very glad to see my dear old friend, Professor Togo. Again, we are sitting in the same panel. Professor Togo is very thoughtful, sound-minded scholar whom I really respect. I think your opinion is really exactly the kind of moderate voices we need in the current difficult situation between China and Japan. I will voice some criticism in my remarks, but that is largely targeting some of the policies the Abe administration is pursuing, which I regard as wrong-headed and counterproductive. I think we all speak in personal capacity as a scholar, so I hope my dear old friend Professor Togo wouldn't take my remarks, criticism of Japanese government position as personal. I think the Japanese government's activism in South China Sea largely stems from its perceived strategic needs in the East China Sea. And from the very beginning, after the Abe took into power in January this year, Japan has been very active in trying to court ASEAN countries. And indeed, the Abe administration has proven to be more eager to play up the China threat rhetoric, partly due to Abe's very strong incentive to mobilize public support, domestic public support for pushing through the constitutional revisions and collective defense right, on which the Japanese public is currently divided. When it comes to South China Sea, Japanese government has leveraged the discourse of freedom of navigation in an attempt to stir up China's threat perception in the region. It has pursued an active foreign policy agenda aiming at beefing up strategic ties and military cooperations with some ASEAN countries. This is understandable because this is what we call the power politics. But what is disturbing, though, I think Ms. Abe has been boasting about constructing, quote-unquote, a strategic encirclement against China. And just about 2 weeks ago, Ms. Abe gave an interview at Wall Street Journal in which he declared that now Japan wanted to be a leader in Asia, not only in economic affairs, but also in security affairs, in terms of counterbalancing or encircling China. And just several days ago, a top Abe security advisor, in an effort to push for the case of collective defense right, he publicly stated that Japan should offer protection to those countries who have territorial disputes with China. I think, wow, when I read the news, I think, well, this is really something. This is American decline, the Japanese version. Slowing up the United States, and now Japan wanted to be the security guarantor of the region. I'm not sure whether or not Mr. Abe truly believes in his anti-China rhetoric. If he does, as he declares now Japan's #1 hypothetical enemy is China, then I think people should start questioning his strategic judgment. Trying to play up China threat rhetoric or constructing an anti-China coalition, I think is not in the interest of the people in the region. And really doubt how many countries in the region will be willing to follow such a Japanese leadership. And in fact, I was in Jakarta about a little bit over a week ago, and attending a Chak2 dialogue there, having met people from all around ASEAN, this region. What I heard from the people very much, I think, echo what my friend Dr. Ralph Amos described in his presentation a while ago. People basically in the region say, if Japan wants to actively engage in economic affairs and play a leadership role in that area, we welcome that. But if Japan wants to say construct a anti-China coalition, no thanks. We don't want such kind of leadership. We hate it to be forced to choose between China and another big power, be it United States or Japan. So I think Mr. Abe really should rethink whether he's advocating a strategic rivalry policy of advocating strategic rivalry with China is a good one, and whether that will bring more welfare and peace and stability to the region or the opposite. I'm also supposed to, I think, talk briefly about Russia's, India's role in the South China Sea. But briefly, I think the Chinese perception about Russian and India's role are generally quite moderate, because it's sort of more regarded as something close to a soft balancing, but not that much. And most Chinese analysts believe that because of limited by capability or intention, the Russia and India is not pursuing aggressively an agenda that is really against China's interests. So I think, generally speaking, China feels much more relaxed about Russia and India's role in South China Sea. And very lastly, a few words about Chinese reaction. And I think, generally speaking, China takes a what I call the long perspective approach. To quote a Chinese poem, which is as quote unquote, "Range far your eyes for long vistas." So basically it means takes a long perspective, and I think we should not lose sight of forest, which is regional cooperation and growth. And that is something really bring peace and prosperity to the region. And as I was talking to the colleagues back in Jakarta from Malaysia and Indonesia and elsewhere, and we all agree that, well, at the end of the day, 99% of the time, we are actually doing business, trade, travel, or maybe argue a little bit, just like we did today here. But that's fine. Only 1% of the time, maybe there's real disputes that need to be managed well. I think a lopsided view, of course, will be misleading and even counterproductive. And
check time, please.
Very last words. I think during recent visit by President Xi Jinping and President Li, I think they have made it very clear the Chinese trying to call for the speed up of connectivities in the region and call for the provided Diamond Decade vision. I think this is, and also of course, China calls for shelf the disputes and joint development. I think this is not easy. It's a lot of challenge ahead, and I think China should make greater effort to reassure the region. And but there's a lot of, I think, encouragement, development, including the agreement between China and Brunei and China and Vietnam to moving toward joint development. I think this is a really good sign, encouraging sign in the positive direction. And I think China needs to play greater effort to reassure the region and to work along with ASEAN countries and other stakeholders to play leadership in trying to manage the disputes and trying to bring more peace and prosperity to the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. It was a very interesting and complex outlook on the main powers, their attitude, meaningly USA, Russia, Japan, India, and China, and finally the China's reaction and assessment. So from this paper we could conclude that the opinion of our paper presenter reflects more flexible, to my mind, attitude of China to these issues. And one of them is that joint development will be a most pragmatic path going forward. As for Russia, let me say 2 words, because it was in the paper. There is nothing to say more, but strengthening ties with ASEAN countries and actively increasing its military profile in the region. Because we have the speaker who will analyze Russian position, I add a little bit, sorry. Okay, the next paper, the next presentation is from our American colleague, Gregory polling about USA interests in the South of China Sea, international law and peaceful dispute resolution. Please, Gregory.
Thank you. Let me start by again thanking the Diplomatic Academy of Viet Nam and the Vietnam Lawyers Association. This is my first time speaking at one of these conferences, the 5th conference, I guess, and it's a real honor. I'd also like to carry forward my colleague's metaphor a bit and point out how peacefully and happily I ceded him the first spot. Although I'm not making any statement by taking the podium, that's just where they put the computer. I've been asked to focus my presentation on the United States' interests in the South China Sea disputes, which I imagine we're going to hear about on pretty much every panel. But to do so, I think it's important to start off by highlighting what the United States is not interested in. First, the U.S. government has consistently maintained that it does not take a position on the sovereignty of any land features in the South China Sea. It has maintained this position with regards to essentially all disputes in Asia, whether it's the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, Dokdo or Takeshima, and in the Spratlys, Paracels, and Scarborough Shoal. Second, the United States really has very little direct interest in disputed resources in the South China Sea. That's not to say that U.S. companies might not, but as far as the U.S. government, there's not that much at stake. Any large-scale oil that would be discovered in the South China Sea would go on the same global spot markets than any other oil. Any natural gas would probably end up piped to the littoral states, and given the shale gas revolution in the states, it probably wouldn't matter that much to the United States anyway. The same goes for fisheries. They are of vital interest to the littoral claimants, but do not directly affect the interests of the United States. So that said, what are the United States' interests? They are precisely what Washington has claimed them to be for at least the last 4 to 5 years. First, the United States is concerned with maintaining peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific, and the South China Sea is a piece of that puzzle. Above all, Washington wants to see these disputes resolved peacefully. The United States recognizes that in the 21st century, its future economic prosperity, its diplomatic and political interests, rest in Asia. Therefore, no one, the United States included, has any interest in seeing disputes over rocks and banks devolve into a real conflict that could upset regional order. Added to this, admittedly, is both a legal and moral imperative on the United States' part toward its treaty allies. In the South China Sea, that means the Philippines, just as it means Japan regarding the East China Sea disputes. If a conflict embroiled either of those states, Washington would find it difficult not to become involved, due to both legal and moral obligations, as I said. The treaty obligations Washington feels toward the Philippines regarding the South China Sea are not nearly as clear as our obligations to Japan regarding the East China Sea. I'd be happy to discuss that farther in Q&A, but suffice it to say that any potential dispute, as it grew larger, would be increasingly difficult for the United States to remain aside. The second interest for the United States, as is often stated, is freedom of navigation. Now, we've all heard the trade stats for the region. We recognize how vital these sea lanes are for the United States and its regional partners. I think China has rightly argued that there is little threat to freedom of navigation for commercial shipping, as we usually understand it. China would not damage its own vital interests by cutting off trade in the South China Sea. The United States recognizes that, nor has there been any indication from any claimant that they would seek to limit commercial transit in these waters. But when the U.S. talks about freedom of navigation, it is including rights to military transit and surveillance in these waters. We can argue about the legal interpretations of what military activities are and are not allowed in an exclusive economic zone, but there are two facts. First, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea does not grant states any right to restrict military activities within an EEZ. Second, the vast majority of parties to UNCLOS agree with the U.S. position that military surveillance is permitted within EEZs of states, as long as that does not enter into territorial waters. The danger inherent in this difference between U.S. and Chinese interpretations of the rights of military activities in EEZs was highlighted pretty blatantly in 2009 with the Impeccable incident, when Chinese ships attempted to interdict a U.S. Navy vessel that was admittedly performing surveillance in the EEZ, but outside of the territorial waters in the South China Sea. Washington does not have any interest in seeing a dispute like that potentially escalate in the future. For Beijing, I think constricting the rights of military surveillance in EEZs is part of a larger goal of pushing the U.S. Navy out of the South China Sea and beyond the first island chain. That's not something that Washington is prepared to accept. We have seen hopeful signs recently that this issue is calming. At this year's ASEAN Regional Forum, Chinese officials confirmed that they had been performing surveillance in U.S. EEZs, presumably meaning Guam, the Marianas Islands, possibly Hawaii. That was responded to the way Washington long said it was going to respond. It didn't particularly care. Obviously, it's going to pay attention, but it wasn't offended. It didn't object. And I find that to be a positive sign. If China is beginning to accept the legitimacy of military surveillance within the EEZ, then that takes off one significant portion of bilateral tension regarding these disputes. Third, and I think most importantly, U.S. interest in the South China Sea is the demand that disputes be resolved in accordance with international law. This is the primary concern that's been voiced by every U.S. official in the region, at least since Secretary of State Hillary Clinton raised the issue at the ARF in 2010. The heart of the South China Sea disputes is the ambiguity of states' claims, as other panelists have said and will continue to say. In China's case, that ambiguity is purposeful. It allows Beijing to claim whatever it wants at any given moment, whether that claim is based on international law or not. And let me be clear on one point. Not a single claimant in the South China Sea has fully declared their maritime and territorial claims. That said, the majority of the current uncertainty can fairly, I think, be laid at Beijing's feet. That's rooted in the fact that everyone else, even if they have not fully delimited claims, have at least been clear that they're going to do so on the basis of UNCLOS. China, meanwhile, gives us the 9-dash line and has refused to tell us exactly what it means. This map shows the maritime claim that China is legally entitled to make from its coastline in purple. The white line is the 9-dash line, which for the sake of clarity I've gone ahead and connected. The purple is based on the 200 nautical mile EEZ, with the exception of median lines where China's claim would run into those for the Philippines and Vietnam. There is no chance that the United States or any of the claimants will accept the 9-dash line without significant clarification on what it means and upon which basis China is claiming it. This is a fundamental concern to the United States because from Washington's perspective, it cuts to the fundamental question of how a rising China will behave in the world. Will it respect the 20th century international order that was admittedly led by the United States, but provided the stability and security for China and the rest of Asia to experience remarkable growth over at least the last 3 decades? The fact is that Washington does recognize that the international order must change to reflect Beijing's growing clout. But the question is whether China will seek to change that system from within, according to accepted rules and norms, or from without. The latter option is not acceptable to Washington, nor has it been acceptable to most other states, including the European Union, regional players like Australia, Japan, Korea, or the ASEAN states. That is why every major summit in the Asia-Pacific for the last at least 4 years has seen the South China Sea disputes and maritime security in general referenced by all major players. We saw that most obviously at the 2011 East Asia Summit when Premier Wen Jiabao was somewhat blindsided to hear 15 of his 17 counterparts voice these concerns. Many observers got excited early last year when China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs began consistently referring to the 9-dash line as only laying claim to islands and adjacent waters that it encompasses. But statements from other parts of the government, especially the People's Liberation Army, make it clear that there is no consensus on that interpretation. Worse has been China's actions in the last year and a half, which have clearly shown that it is not limiting its claims to only those it would be entitled to from the Spratlys or the Paracels. Here are the island features in the South China Sea that could conceivably be entitled to an EEZ under UNCLOS. By an admittedly very generous definition, about 50 qualify as islands. If every one of those features was given a 200 nautical mile EEZ where possible, and a median line were drawn everywhere else, just as Mark Valencia said earlier, we get the following map. This is the area of the South China Sea that can claim to be legally in dispute. The red area is a dispute caused by the Paracels, the green by the Spratlys, the yellow by Scarborough Shoal. It's still a large area, but you can see that it is significantly smaller. Well, you can't really make out, but there it is. Significantly smaller than the area encompassed by the 9-dash line. Frankly, I believe if Chinese officials described its claims to the South China Sea this way and agreed to forego violence in pursuing it, much of Washington's anxiety over the disputes would dissipate. But this is clearly not yet Beijing's claim. To illustrate, these are the 9 oil and gas blocks that the China National Offshore Oil Corporation put out for bids in June 2012. Vietnam objected. You can see how valid those objections were. Even if China were given possession of every land feature in the South China Sea, and all of those features were given a full entitlement, Beijing still would have no legal basis to claim most of the area in which these blocks lie. No. There we go. Oil and gas blocks created by Hanoi and Manila offer us another example. On this map, red blocks are those currently being leased to foreign oil and gas companies, white or not. Beijing frequently objects to exploration in any of these blocks, but you can see that the vast majority lie entirely in undisputed waters. This was highlighted last year by the Philippines' decision to open 15 oil and gas blocks to foreign bids. 2 of them, areas 3 and 4, which are the 2 vertical to the north there of Palawan, drew objections by China. You can see that they lie wholly in undisputed waters. The point of this is that the United States does not have a particular stake in these oil and gas blocks, nor does it have a particular stake in any islands or features. What it does have a stake in seeing is that China is willing to abide by the international order, and if it wants to change it, to do so through that order, not by overthrowing it. That's about my time. I'll go ahead and wrap it up there, and I look forward to any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Gregory. You keep in time. It was the fastest presentation during 10 minutes. I like very much this map to show us the problems of oil exploration and gas exploration, especially for Vietnam and Russian companies here. Okay, thank you. The position of our speaker is quite clear. That's the turn of Professor Kazuhiko Togo, Director of the Institute of World Affairs, Kyoto, Tokyo, Japan. Please. Japan and the South China Sea in the context of new East Asian power relations.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. I myself was a diplomat in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and my major preoccupation then was Japan-Russia relations. So the Northern Territory was a kind of my life work. I retired from the Foreign Ministry in 2002, after which I became more interested on territorial issues in Northeast Asia, that is Senkaku and Takeshima. So today is my first trial to expand a little bit of my thinking and stretch out my thinking to South China Sea issues. 2.5 years ago, I sensed certain danger, certain ominous feeling about the situation on territorial issues in Northeast Asia. So I thought that before things get worse, as an academician, I have to settle my position. So in May 2011, at Shanghai Forum, I presented 3 following principles. First, the claiming party should refrain from using physical or military force. Second, the status quo party, I mean the party which is actually in control of the territories, should be ready to listen and talk. And third, the 2 sides should engage in establishing confidence-building measures and strengthen trust. let me go back quickly. How situation looked like 2.5 years ago. About the claiming side, Japan was claiming northern territories. Japan was claiming Takeshima Dokdo, and China was claiming Senkaku Ryautai. About the first principle, Japan led completely peaceful negotiations vis-à-vis Russia. Japan also led completely peaceful negotiations vis-à-vis Korea, even not to put the issue at the centrality of the relations for years. Now, China, basically, in my view, have practiced peaceful approach to this issue and proposed to shelve. Now, on the status quo side, Russia, after Gorbachev came into power, I would like to commend the policy taken by Russia because Russia began to show readiness to talk. And we have been talking and talking and talking for now nearly 30 years. It's so regrettable that I cannot produce an outcome yet, but at least peaceful negotiations are on. Now, South Korea, at this point in time, the policy of South Korea is that territorial issue doesn't exist, therefore I'm not going to talk with the Japanese, which in my principle I cannot comment, but I hasten to add that South Korean policy on Takeshima has been much more subtle. And the present policy emerged on the surface in the middle of 1990s. Now, Japan's policy on Senkaku is a bit complicated because, in my view, Japan has accepted for long this shelving in the form of tacit understanding. But from the middle of the 1990s, Japanese legal position came to negate the existence of the issue and not approving any talks with the Chinese. Now, in order that my principle stands, there is one point which has to be cleared. This is a point: when was the dividing date of claimer in the status quo emerged? On Russia, very clear, Northern Territories was occupied by Russia in 1945, and Russia then became the party which implements actual control, and Japan became a claimer. South Korea, to some people's amazement, the point when South Korea occupied in full Takeshima was in 1954, 9 years after the end of the war, and this is a point from which Japan became a claimer. Now, Senkaku, use of force has never been seen in these 68 years. The point when Senkaku became under Japanese control was in 1895. So before 1971, when China and Taiwan both began to claim, and after, forces have never been used in this region. Now, compared to this situation in Northeast Asia, where emotion was high, but basically negotiations was very. Can you reproduce, because it is shown in my head? It is shown here. So emotion is high, but negotiation has been very peaceful. Situation in Paracel and Spratly, looking from.
Could you help us some break here in computer?
Because it is shown here,
yeah,
it's gone from. Yeah, okay,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So, looking from the north, the situation in the south is staggering, full of violence, continuous usage of military and physical forces. I don't need to explain to you, but January 19, 1974, Chinese troops defeated South Vietnamese and occupied western part of Paracel. 2, in March 14, 1988, skirmishes at Johnson South Reef between China and Vietnam, and China won. Not exactly military force, but 1994, China built structures at the Mischief Reef of Spratly, adding real tensions between the related countries. So, can we apply the three principles to South China Sea? My answer is yes and no. Yes, how can we? Well, can we consider November the 4th, 2002, when the Declaration of Conduct was adopted as a dividing date between the status quo power and claiming powers? If we can do that, there is a distinct possibility to consider the issues North and South together, but probably not, because there are too many territories where claims duplicate between neither side has established uncontested effective control. Claims duplicate, but neither side has established uncontested effective control. Under this situation, 2012, bad year. From my perspective, bad year. In South, April 2012, at Scarborough Shoal standoff began between Chinese coastal guards and Vietnamese Navy. In September, China began constructing blocks. This morning, I was reminded about the second Thomas Shoal tensions. Maybe need to be put somewhere there. But in North, September 2012, triggered by government of Japan's purchase of Senkaku, China, on a regular basis, began sending their coastal guards into the territorial waters of Senkaku. Is there hope? I think there is a hope. In North, Abe, from the beginning of this year, more precisely from February 2013, began stating that there is no territorial issue, but the door for dialogue is always open. I think I can congratulate myself that Abe is following my second principle. Abe is now clearly stating that there should be a dialogue, and Abe is prepared for this. So I'm telling all my Chinese friends that this is a great opportunity to be engaged in dialogue and to resolve our differences. And Professor Wang this morning said very interesting thing about this shelving. If what Professor Wang mentioned about shelving literally means, and the content is important, literally means to bring back the situation from the point of 1972 to 2012, somewhere there, meaning that China will stop entering into the territorial waters, and Japan will preserve the present three no's, which is not to land, not to investigate, and not to construct. Then there is a full hope for reaching an agreement reasonably soon. And if it is not working, I think the channel of dialogue between the leadership of Japan and the leadership of China is something is wrong. And this, in my view, can be derived from only one reason: lack of trust. And this brings me to the situation in South Asia. This morning, I tried to listen very carefully to sense the direction of the room. But this September the 15th meeting at Suzhou, ASEAN and Chinese high-level officials talks, and the positive atmosphere is emerging to the direction of code of conduct. If my sense of understanding in the room is correct, I felt while some misgivings were expressed, but on the whole, some positive direction towards increased effort in finding agreeable line of code of conduct. And this, to me, if that can be reached, the key factor will be trust. Trust does not emerge just out of words. Trust emerges only out of the combination of policy orientation and actions. And I hope that in North and South, we will be able to reach this fundamental situation of trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. In this presentation, we find a very useful approach that is the trust is, of course, more compatible and have prospects against and vis-à-vis the use of the force. And to my mind, this presentation and the views of our colleague was quite optimistic. Implication of three principles that he checked out, I agree, raise the hope for reconciliation. That's why this process is moving ahead. It's especially important. This optimistic view is reflected in other reports. As for Russia, only one note that it was said that Russia occupied by force Japan islands, but to my mind it would be more correctly to say that it was legal action based on the San Francisco Treaty on international law. Okay, we keep in time. All presentators do it very fast, so we could have free space for discussion. And now Dr. Subhash Kapila from India. It is the think tank South Asia Analysis Group. He represents here. Please, Doctor, would you stay on the place? Okay. Your turn, please.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I feel very honored to be present here this afternoon amongst a crowd of international repute and my Vietnamese friends. Normally I never speak on India's low-east policy, but at times one could get subjective while speaking on this. But then India's low-east policy is not India's initiative alone. India started the initiative, but it is met. Now it's a two-way process between India and ASEAN. The policy started in 1992 with very modest objectives of political and economic integration with ASEAN and East Asia. Today, fast forward into 2012, ASEAN and India at the commemorative summit issued a joint vision statement in which ASEAN designated India as a strategic partner. That itself validates India's low-east policy and the remarkable progress that both sides have made. Why this progress could be made? One was that India had no territorial disputes or claims of sovereignty with any ASEAN nation. Secondly, in the pursuit of its look-east policies and Act East initiatives, India respected the centrality of ASEAN while concurrently pursuing strengthening of bonds with individual ASEAN nations. But there also, it was within the overall framework of the centrality of ASEAN. And of course, the strategic trust, which was mentioned by a speaker just now, that also has played a big part, where in 20 years, from political and economic integration, in the vision statement, the first item was political and security cooperation, and out of the 8 or 9 clauses there, 6 or 7 are on defense and security cooperation, and especially with reference to maritime security and maritime security cooperation. So that itself speaks about what progress has been achieved. And lastly, on the introductory observations, I do want to make a point that in India, there is bipartisan political support for India's low-east policy and the initiatives it pursues while acting east. I'll briefly now cover the 2 decades of Indo-ASEAN engagement, and these follow into 2 time spans of 1992 to 2002 and 2002 to 2012. The first decade, of course, as I mentioned, was seeking political and economic integration. Some analysts believe that the progress was slow at this time, but then, of course, the reasons were that both sides were mutually sizing up each other's intentions, capabilities, and the move forward. And also at this particular time, ASEAN were looking more north than east. The second decade was, of course, more significant in that, and it can be rightfully be termed as India's Act East decade. India during this period received much traction in its Act East initiatives, generated by politico-strategic dynamics, namely 2. One was India's significant economic leap and economic growth, and second was India's military leap in terms of nuclear weaponization and indigenous advanced missile program and space programs. Now, what was the impact of this? The impact of this was, first to begin with the United States. It started recognizing India's potential power and moved forward to evolve a US-India strategic partnership. Now, this itself had 2 major impacts on India's Look-East policy. The first was with East Asia, because the United States coming proximate to India in terms of strategic convergences, Japan and South Korea were less diffident in a strategic reach out to India. Similarly, in ASEAN also started recognizing that there was India in the neighborhood, which in the global shift of power, there may have been differentials in power, but the global shift of power to Asia was multipolar in nature, in that China, Japan and India had emerged as the 3 major powers who impelled the shift to Asia. Now, in the second decade, you find substantial political relationships being developed by India with each of the ASEAN countries, besides the centrality of ASEAN. And secondly, in political terms, the very fact that an ASEAN-India summit in the 20th year of its inception moved towards designation India's strategic partner speaks of the political achievements that were made. And in strategic terms, again, what has happened in this decade is that India cultivated, developed, and moved forward individual strategic, military and defense relationships, and this tapestry, strategic tapestry, starts off from South Korea to Japan to Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, all the way to Myanmar. So here was and India did not, it was a silent effort, not with much diplomatic flamboyance or too much of assertion. But the fact is that India today enjoys a lot of strategic convergences all the way from East Asia into ASEAN. Now let me move on to India and South China Sea. Now, I don't know how many of you ever wondered that the South China Sea is not only confined to the Pacific littoral. The South China Sea extends all the way from the Straits of Taiwan to the Malacca Straits. And therefore, South China Sea is virtually located at India's doorsteps, with the Andaman and Nicobar Islands virtually a stone throw from the Straits of Malacca. So therefore, India has legitimate security interests in the security and stability of South China Sea. as any turbulence in this region could adversely affect India's national security interests. South China Sea is also important to India for its trade and commerce. Nearly 53% of India's external trade traverses the South China Sea, and also for its energy security, where India is diversifying its oil imports from the Pacific, from the Sakhalin Islands in Russia, and maybe tomorrow further east. Now, in terms of India's positions on South China Sea, they are in absolute consonance with those of the international community, including the United States, which maintains that the global commons are international waters, the freedom of navigation, all that was said just now by the United States Speaker. India is committed to all that, and it also finds mention in the ASEAN-India Vision Statement of 2012. Now, in terms of, India is not a party to any of the disputes, but it cannot remain also a detached observer, because anything which happens in South China Sea, by virtue of its geostrategic location, going right up to opposite the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, does affect India's national security, and tomorrow it will also have bearings in what unfolds in the Indian Ocean region. Now, not because of any threat perceptions or any other questions of containment or anything else, but India over the years has learnt that prudence pays more, because you have to go by the political-strategic dynamics in progress and not on the deciphering of intentions. And therefore, in this direction, India started its own preparations of naval build-up, which was so far concentrated on the Arabian Sea, and in the last few years it has moved towards Bay of Bengal, and you find that there's substantial progress made there in terms of the allotment of resources and allotment of the primacy to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, because all of them play a very significant strategic role in any future contingency. Along with this, India has also, and which again finds in the vision statement, India has been engaged in the capacity building of the navies and air force of ASEAN nations, especially those with whom we started off much early, like Singapore and Vietnam, and of course today it extends all over. My concluding observation, lack of time, was that the strategic dynamics have played an important part right from the inception to look east and to the act east, and these sort of processes cannot be divorced. And the example is that during the Cold War, when India was being looked upon with suspicion, even by the United States, and today in 2012, on the verge of the third decade of ASEAN-India proximate relationships, it is the United States which eggs on India to become the net provider of security for the Asia-Pacific, and it is ASEAN that has expectations that India should evolve into a regional balancer, or maybe only a soft regional balancer. So that itself is a testimony that India's look east policy has met with substantial successes, and as again as said, it is based on respecting the centrality of ASEAN, and it would continue as such. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapila. It was a very clear estimation of the Indian policy in the region, and I think we have concluded that Indian look east policy Act East and South China Sea became more and more proactive. And of course, South China Sea, located in the doorsteps of India, that's why, of course, this country has a legitimate interest in this region. And I would like to pay your attention to the concluding that the conflict escalation in the South China Sea has been a wake-up call for ASEAN as a whole. And it is no longer advisable, and only unquestionable unity is strategic imperative. And one more conclusion, to my mind, is extremely important, and it summarizes any part the previous speakers, some of them, that there is an increasing strategic convergence of views on regional security between, in this example, India and some other countries. That's the main, to my mind, ideas of this presentation. And the last, but is the first lady here, Teresa Fallon, Senior Associate with European Institute of ASEAN Studies. We hope she will introduce for us European position in this difficult claims.
Well, thank you, Professor MAZYRIN, for your kind introduction. I want to thank the Vietnam Lawyers Association and the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for inviting me to this amazing event. It's so helpful, because I'm based in Europe, to come here and hear what people have to say, so I'm very grateful to be here. Does anybody know what this day is? It's very important on the European calendar. 11/11/11. You know everything, don't you, Carl? All right, very good. This is Armistice Day, and it's a good reminder of why we're here. All right, so today I'm going to talk about the U.S. rebalance. Everyone's very familiar with that, so I'll just touch on it briefly. What role for Europe, approach of NATO, and NATO is becoming more of a player because it's becoming interlinked with Europe, and future challenges, and then concluding comments. So this is a painting by Otto Dix, pretty horrible, but it is the anniversary today of Armistice Day, the end of World War I. All right, there are 4 pillars of the rebalance. It's not PC to say pivot anymore. In Brussels, you must say rebalance. So it's partnerships, presence, power, projection, and principles. We have to make up the 4 Ps somehow. And this idea of free and open commerce is very important. Now, last year I used this cartoon, thanks to my son. This Captain Transatlantic doesn't exist. People asked me about him and wondered if he was in a movie. No, I just made it up. But it was to symbolize the growing warmth of transatlantic relations. And this is just 1 year later, and I wouldn't say Captain Transatlantic is around anymore. So Europe's mini pivot, it might have been unique, the relationship between Hillary Clinton and Baroness Ashton. I mean, they really got along well. They would shut the door, send out all of their advisors, and there was almost a push-pull in their relationship, and things started to happen slowly, but things were happening. The joint statement, which we know happened in July 2012, and then this idea of an unprecedented re-engagement of transatlantic dialogue on Asia. So finally, things were happening, slowly, baby steps, but things were happening. In 2013, it's not so cheery, it's not so rosy, and maybe the press doesn't really give it as much attention, but I was just in Germany a few days ago, and it's really something surprisingly upsetting the entire transatlantic relationship. So hopefully it might just be a bargaining chip. And I'm going to say something rather provocative because, okay, that's how 2013 looks when you have Captain Europe and Captain America separated. All right. TTIP is also starting the second round of negotiations today. Everyone's probably familiar with the TPP, but TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And this could be a huge game changer. And I see it as the other part of the rebalance to Asia, because if Europe and the US combine their economies, that will be something completely unprecedented, and will tie their foreign policies together as well. Perhaps it will tie their foreign policies. I said it would be a bit provocative. All right, so there is a big difference in threat perception between the Europeans and the Americans. The Europeans see Asia as very far away. There has been a change in their viewpoint. I see it more as they want to carve out a separate approach to the region, separate from the US and separate from China. Now, the big issue about foreign policy making in China, in Europe, is it's so hard to trace. It's very, very complex. Everyone is trying to claw some power. Ashton doesn't really have much power. She doesn't know how to really use the power that she does have. So Europe obviously has had a lot of financial and economic issues that they've been focusing on. And it's interesting, in new academic papers, European academics are talking about their earlier pivot, the pivot before the Americans, which they're referring to as 2003. With the Iraq War, Europeans decided to pivot towards China, so the pivot is more Sino-centric, and they talk about their views on Asia in 2003. There's also papers talking about, emphasizing all the things that they've done before the Americans announced the pivot, but the US has always been in the region, so it's an interesting development over the last year. And alongside lines of conferences, even at NATO meetings, which are completely on the record, I've heard calls for lifting of the arms embargo. Now, this is an interesting line to take because Europe is now trying to improve their relations with ASEAN, because in the past their relations were mostly towards China and ASEAN felt ignored, so Europe is trying to make up for lost time. But by playing around with the arms embargo, it also disappoint and discourage ASEAN. Okay, so everyone's jockeying for position in the South China Sea. Why should Europe be there too? Why should they get involved? And is there a role for them in the region? Okay, so Europe has had so many problems. They're very isolated. Questions about will the euro survive? Will the European Union survive? Will these countries break off? Greece, all these issues that they've been really focused on for the last several years. They've had very little time and attention for Asia. I've read a figure that Barroso spends about 96% of his time on financial matters. So the EU is very inward-looking, and they're not very involved in the multipolar diplomacy. This again leads us to the problem that Kissinger said, when I want to call Europe, who do I call? There are very many competing poles of power. Is it at the Commission level? Is it at the nation-state level? We see China very nimbly working with member states on a bilateral relationship. And Jan Teckau is from Carnegie Europe, and he's very brash in his description of Europe's foreign policy passivity. And he just doesn't see it. If you look at their website, they're always complaining about how Europe, which makes up a huge population, 28 member states, really has no foreign policy voice. Now, this is from the cover of The Economist. So Europe has been very focused on their economy, and the question is, will they either have a tighter union or, will the euro collapse? The way they've handled the crisis has really lowered people's perceptions of the way Europe is. It's no longer such a shining example. Now, when I try to get people interested in this region, the South China Sea, I always try to emphasize the economic interests of Europe, because if anything happens there, it would really have a huge effect on Europe's economy. The flow of containers, the most 20-foot, goes through this choke point. So Europe would really have a lot of economic problems if there should be any problems in the Straits. I think I took it out. Also, rare earths was a big wake-up call for Europe because it seemed far away. It wasn't really focused on them, but once there was a rare earths embargo, German industry, for example, really suffered. They needed that for their high-tech equipment. Okay, the EU is China's largest trading partner, and the EU is also the largest foreign investor in ASEAN. So the EU does have an approach to the South China Sea. They've stated that they would like to see the territorial disputes solved peacefully. They support UNCLOS, and they encourage all parties to clarify their claims. What are the carrots and sticks in Europe's toolbox? Well, China is dependent on trade with the EU. It's a major market, and if they use it carefully, they might be able to leverage it. But we've seen with the solar panels that Europe has not been very good at leveraging those types of issues. They can influence UN resolutions, and though they're not a main player in the region, they can have some impact too by using diplomatic channels. Okay, what can the EU bring of relevance to the South China Sea? As 28 member states, they've learned by doing. It's taken a lot of years, it hasn't been easy, they've made a lot of mistakes, and then they keep going, they muddle through, and they keep improving. So ASEAN, that's a good example that things don't always work out the way you plan them, but it's constant tweaking the system. So the EU has experienced a common fisheries policy. They're very good at marine protection, and they've been very helpful in resolution disputes in the Arctic, for example. Recently, over the last year, there has been an improvement in EU-ASEAN relations. It's called the Enhanced Partnership. There are many meetings now in Brussels. Next month or in a few weeks' time, there will be a meeting in Indonesia on maritime issues. So it's really picking up in Europe, which is a promising sign because then it gets on people's agenda and on their radar. The EU is ASEAN's first ever dialogue partner, and they actually gave a lot of seed money at the beginning of ASEAN. Okay, so they have, the EU is the first source of foreign direct investment into ASEAN, and also they're working on FTAs, free trade agreements. There are many in the region, but Europe thinks that this should help tie these countries closer together to the EU. All right. So Europe signed the TAC back in July, but they're very eager to enter the EAS. It doesn't look very promising that they'll enter, but this has been something to motivate Europe to become more involved in the region. Another sticking point was an ambassador to ASEAN. They have limited funds, but the EU has decided to send an ambassador to ASEAN. Right now, there's a double-hatted ambassador who's ambassador to Indonesia and ASEAN. All right. The EU and ASEAN have many common problems, and that could be a point of reference in their discussions. They tend to allow their unity to be split by outside powers, and they need to figure out how to be better regional organizations. Unfortunately, we see what happened last year at the ASEM meeting. Even the EU can fall under pressure of taking things off the agenda. ASEM, a few years ago, when it was held in Brussels, High Representative Ashton didn't even bother to show up to the meeting. Because of a lot of lobbying by ASEAN officials, it's become more important on the agenda. So we see, for example, last year the French president attended, Rampuy attended, and Barroso. This year will be the same thing. So at the ASEM summit last year, China sent out démarches to advise not to have the South China Sea discussed, and it was taken off the agenda. So if Europe really wants to have a, they stand for certain things, they should really stand for them and not change their minds so easily. Okay, although Europe has perceived having a declining role in the region, they're a huge economic player, so they should have a little more say, or at least have a little more of a presence. Not military presence, but perhaps a diplomatic presence. One of Europe's biggest fears is to be left on the sidelines, and that there would only be a G2 between the US and China. I mentioned this earlier about the rare earths wake-up call. Okay. Chinese investment in the EU, as you can see from this chart, has increased dramatically. And how will that translate in the future in regard to levers of power and influence in the region is yet to be seen. But this is really impressive amount of investment, and the trend will continue. So we've seen problems in trade in regard to the solar panels. But it seems that the EU and China are working things out. Okay, that's my part on the EU. Now I'm going to look at NATO. So how does NATO adjust? After they leave Afghanistan in 2014, what will be on their agenda? What's important to NATO, and how can they guarantee why they built a $1 billion building which they have not yet moved into? So Ambassador Ivo Dalda wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs about 10 years ago called Global NATO. He's just retired now from the NATO, but it seems that his idea of global NATO has taken on a very different role than he had envisioned. Japan is one of the earliest partners of NATO. They donated $5 billion to Afghanistan in exchange. Not in exchange, it's not a quid pro quo, but they gave money to Afghanistan, and this was negotiated for over 3 years. Finally, because of each other's schedule, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the Secretary General of NATO, went to Tokyo and signed a joint political declaration. It's the first time it was ever done. He also went to Korea, but I decided to just focus on Japan in this part. They also have an agreement with Australia, as you know, and now they're talking about Brazil. So their partners are supposed to have similar values, and they call it values-based diplomacy. But Anders Fogh Rasmussen made it very clearly in a very carefully worded statement that NATO has no intention to be present as an alliance in Asia. They signed this agreement, but in that sense, I think Japan might have been a bit disappointed because it was almost ignoring the tensions in the region. NATO wants to be a player. Asia is very important, but they won't be present. These partners also donate money to NATO projects, so that could also be one of the motivations to have partners. Europe is facing financial austerity. As you may know, the US pays 75% of the NATO budget. It will be reduced to 50%. Where is that money going to come from? Europe is continuing to cut their budgets, their defense budgets. All right.
Teresa, I'm sorry. Check time, please.
Okay, I'll wind this up. Okay. All right. So European military spending is less than 1.7% overall. Okay, so NATO needs to work with the EU. That's probably the only way they're going to work it out. They have a separation, and oh dear. Okay. So NATO wants to reimagine themselves as a transatlantic political platform and kind of a talking shop to keep up on all the developments in the region. Okay, NATO-China relations. This is one of the interesting parts. After the meeting in Tokyo, Brangelman secretly flew to Beijing to debrief them about what happened in Japan, which seemed like such a shock for everybody involved. And it was mentioned on the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs site. So the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs was more transparent than NATO on this. All right. And last question. Who knows what this date means? And no Chinese can answer. Okay, you can answer. You don't know. This is the anniversary. This is the date that the Chinese embassy was bombed by NATO. And this is something that might be very difficult for China to overcome because everybody of that generation, protested and they had marches, and it's something that every school child remembers. So this is something that, for cooperation between NATO and China, something which has to be overcome. So this is the Chinese embassy bombing. And also, while Rasmussen was in Tokyo, he was giving a China pitch, almost tone deaf to the tensions in the region, saying, I want to work with China, we want them to be, we have a relationship with all the other members on the Security Council, and we want to have a special relationship with China. So as I said, to use NATO as a global security forum, future challenges are, can EU be seen as an honest broker? Why the EU? Why not some other country? They have also a colonial legacy in some countries that might be painful. Relations between NATO and China, when Afghanistan has a border on China, so NATO probably would like to be able to communicate with China. How that will develop remains to be seen. Increased Chinese economic levers in the region may have a real impact in future policy making. There are EU FTAs with many countries, as you can see right there, and the Arctic also comes into play. It's a two-way street. It's not just the US. Since the US isn't a signatory to UNCLOS, they really do need Europe to help them at the table, because member states of UNCLOS, Europeans are members of UNCLOS, and they can help interpret the law since the US is not a signatory. And on a bright spot, or somewhat bright spot, in the Gulf of Aden is the only place on Earth where China, Japan, the US, and other European navies cooperate. It's almost like using a bazooka to kill a mosquito, but they're working together, and it's creating a habit of cooperation. Can that cooperation be transferred to another part of the world remains to be seen. So in conclusion, Europe has an interest to help build up a robust multilateral and rules-based security order in Asia. The EU needs to be seen as an honest broker, and the EU has relevant experiences and assets to offer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. It was a comprehensive insight on European policy in this region, and I would like to stress some interesting point to my mind. It's the rebalancing in the United States policy towards Europe, the same position of the Europe. New format of cooperation of trade and investment for this new initiative, and the meeting will start soon on TTIP. Very unusual to my mind approach is the question about, is this situation of involvement of major powers means the strategic marginalization or not? And one more, I think, is quite right approach, that the policy and positions of some kind of Europe is quite passive in this region, and it could be more proactive. And the optimistic view is that maritime security, of course, is the global interest and the value. I agree with it. So we finished with the presentations, and now we have, I think, about half an hour to discuss, to pose the questions for our participants. Please, who would like to?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dong Manyuan, Vice President of China Institute of International Studies. Now, I carefully listened to 3 sessions. What impressed me most was that there are some worries and upsets and uneasy feelings about the future of South China Sea. So now I can contribute to this session is that my 5 confidences and my 5 don't worries. First.
Sorry, but shortly, please, because you have 2 minutes.
I have full confidence in the future of relations between China and ASEAN. Even though the topic of this conference focuses on South China Sea, but the issue is not the issue between China and ASEAN as a whole. Many historical and current factors push ASEAN and China should be, can be, and must be the community of shared destiny. So don't worry about the future of the relations between China and ASEAN. Second, I have the full confidence in the future for China and some claimant countries to finally solve the maritime disputes peacefully. During the initial years of New China, we have the border disputes with all neighbors, but now we solved all these border disputes with all neighbors except for India and Bhutan, though through peaceful means, friendly consultations and diplomatic negotiations. By the way, the border talks and consultation between China and India and China and Bhutan is underway. This historical phenomenon demonstrated that the peaceful means is the only solution to all kinds of disputes in the world. So I strongly believe that China can solve the maritime disputes with all claimant countries through peaceful means, so don't worry. Third, I have the full confidence in the relations between China and Vietnam. Being a neighbor with Vietnam is a historical honor for China. Vietnam is a beautiful, great country, a heroic nation. The friendship and cooperation between China and Vietnam has historical and current reasons and basis. China has already solved border disputes with Vietnam through peaceful means and attached great importance to the bilateral relations with Vietnam. Both countries have enough wisdom and competence to solve the maritime disputes step by step. The differences between China and Vietnam is the difference between brothers, sisters, and comrades. So we have the resources to accommodate our differences. Any endeavor, any maneuver to incite, to create conflicts between China and Vietnam will doom to be a failure. So don't worry about the relations between China and Vietnam. Fourth, I have the full confidence in the relations between China and the Philippines, because the people-to-people friendship has solid historical base. The policy of confronting China is against the fundamental interests of Philippine people. The future of the bilateral relations will be determined by the willing of the two peoples, not by some politicians, not by some social elite. By my observation, currently, the majority of the Philippine people care about how to survive from the typhoon disaster, how to get a job, how to avoid the misery from the official corruptions, how to live a better life, not something else. So don't worry about the future between the two countries and the future of the peaceful solution on maritime disputes. Finally,
I'm sorry, dear colleague, you
1 minute.
Already 5 minutes. Your time limit is overcome.
I have the full confidence in Sino-American relations.
Yes,
The two countries agreed to set up a new type of big power relations. U.S. clearly and rationally knows how important the Sino-American relationship is, especially in comparison with other relations. So don't worry about the future of China-U.S. relations. Don't try to make the usage of the differences between the two countries. No hope for such an endeavor. Please give up such an idea. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your emotion speak. But of course we have no enough time to make more presentation here in this section. Probably you have any reaction because it's on the China Sea. Yeah, please.
I just want to say I fully agree with what the professor says. I think we should. There's always, I think, whenever I get into discussions with my friends and colleagues, I think in the regions, it's always the question of whether or not you have this, half full, half empty perspective. I tend to be on the half full camp, and I think a positive attitude is also, and of course, pragmatism, and the idea and the spirit of cooperation. I think those things are very important. So like I said in my presentation, I think we should take a long perspective. Yes.
Thank you. More questions, please? Please. This side, next.
Thank you. I'm Nguyen Ngọc Truong, a retired diplomat, an ambassador, and now a freelance researcher and writer. I have a comment, and then I have a question to Professor Wang from Peking University. Recently, there's a very important and interesting development of Chinese diplomacy, focusing on neighbors. Some call it smiling diplomacy, some call it neighbor diplomacy. Anyway, that is in September and October, much more on neighbor than the relation with the United States. And during that, there's a visit by Prime Minister Lee to Viet Nam, and in a statement there's 3 points. One of the points is two sides agree to form a working group on South China Sea. From my point of view, it's very interesting, and we hope the negotiation on border will be coming into negotiation into the sea. So the question is, Professor, how do you see this process will go? When, how fast, and can it bring a breakthrough to the settlement, peaceful settlement of Southeast Asian issues? Thank you.
All right. Thanks, I really appreciate this. I think this is an excellent question. I think everyone in this room, I think perhaps we should all ask this question. I do wish I have the crystal ball in my hand so that I can tell you when, on which date we can finally reach a peaceful settlement on these disputes. But I think realistically speaking, I think I remember over the lunch, Professor Mark Valencia and others, we sat together and we talked. And I think my sense is that we perhaps never be able to resolve the disputes in the sort of legal sense, decide, well, this belongs to me and that belongs to you. But however, I think with pragmatism and the sort of spirit of cooperation, and really this kind of forward-looking approach, I think we can all realize that the better approach is just to really try to stabilize the situation, try to manage the disputes, and therefore I think DOC or COC, these are all a very good process, and China is a very active part of that. And as to how fast we will anticipate a breakthrough, I perhaps tend to be a little bit more sort of cautious or sort of cautiously optimistic about that. I think we also has to be realistic about the complexity of the disputes and involving all different parties, and we just have to I think do this with good faith, with the real mentality for cooperation and mutual respect and the reciprocity. I think with that spirit, I think we will move, closer and closer to the final peaceful settlement of these disputes. Yeah.
Thank you. I ask you for the question to other countries' representatives, not only for China. Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Termsak from the ASEAN Studies Center in Singapore. It's good to hear that our Chinese friends don't have any worries. But we, from smaller country, we still worry. Because China doesn't see there is a problem in South China Sea, and that's a big worry to us. But anyway, I have a particular specific question for Dr. Dong Wang toward the end of your presentation, you mentioned a meeting of Chinese agency to formulate policy toward neighboring countries of China. Can you share with us some more information? What is the outcome of that meeting? Because China Premier has proposed a new treaty on good neighborliness and friendly cooperation with ASEAN member states. That may be similar to what China has with Russia in 2001. But my question also is that how can we have such a treaty when we still have disputes in South China Sea, territorial dispute in South China Sea? China had the agreement with Russian Federation only after settling all the land dispute, territorial land dispute with Russia. But we still have pending territorial dispute in South China Sea. Can we have a good neighborliness treaty while the territorial dispute in South China Sea is still pending?
Yes. I can't postpone you this question.
You want to postpone it? Or?
No, please.
Okay.
But
sorry.
The next.
Sorry for taking up times, but I think this question to a great extent also echo the first question I have. So therefore, I just want to say very briefly a few words about that. I think yes, this was a very, very important meeting indeed. It's called the 周边工作 会议, I think enabling policy, working meeting on the enabling policy. And the importance of that meeting, I think, is manifested in the fact that it was attended by virtually all, I think, the Politburo members, Central Committee members, and all provincial leaders, and from the military, and virtually all, I think, the powerful men and women, those who, the real policymakers in China, they were all brought together. And basically, my impression is that I think the top leaders, President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang, they really want to reach a consensus among the highest leadership of China, basically saying that, you know, what is most sort of pivotal for China's continued peaceful development in the years and decades to come, which is to really to maintain a very good external environment, and of course to keep and maintain a very good relations with China's neighbors. In that, I think it's very interesting. Actually, I think the text of President Xi Jinping's speech has been, I think, published in full length, and you can easily, I think, Google and search and find it. I would strongly encourage you to read it. Just instead, you know, it's because a lot of information, details, very rich information are out there, and you will get a deeper sense of what's in the Chinese leader's mind when it comes to the issues, I think, in terms of China's neighboring policy. And the last words, regarding your question, whether or not I think we can have a good neighboring policy, at the same time we have disputes. I think the reality has already answered this question. Yes, despite we have problems, disputes, still I think, you know, if we look back in the past 20 years, 30 years, I think really there is extraordinary progress in terms of the China-ASEAN relations. It's a historical achievement. I think, therefore, I'm with a half-full sort of camp, and I'm pretty optimistic about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Let me, as a chairman, to pose a question to Teresa. It is a very interesting statement about strategic marginalization. What does it mean? Could you explain a little bit about it?
Okay. Jonathan Hoosleg is an academic at VIX in Belgium, and he coined this term strategic marginalization. He's from Belgium, which I know there's some Belgians here. It's a smaller country, so they tend to think it's better to just kind of put ourselves on the side and not get involved because we're not powerful enough to get involved. We don't have any real military might, so why embarrass ourselves and get involved? So he has advocated in op-eds and in academic papers in Brussels strategic marginalization. I call it a fancy pants way of saying sitting on your hands, but this is what he's advocating. And it's something that some policymakers are interested in.
More applicable for small countries, probably.
I think,
yeah?
well, maybe that's how they tend to think, but the EU has pretty much adopted that.
Thank you. My call for the audience, please pose the questions on other countries. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Soku Lee from Korea. I have the brief questions to the Ambassador Togo. I fully understand the territorial issues in Asia, not only East Asia, but also South China Sea we talked today, is highly related with the post-World War arrangement, which is the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951, which you mentioned today. But if you look at the very closely, very nature of the disputes in East Asia in which Japan is engaged at this moment, I think you gloss over the very important facts. From time to time to mention about the force. The term of force is very simple, but you're mainly talking about the force in a post-World War arrangement. You do not mention about the historical context of the dispute you engage. For example, all the territorial issues in East Asia derive from when Japan expanded their territory during the Japanese colonial imperial era. So without having that colonial context, which is very unique at this moment, because if you look at the issues right now, Japan engaged in East Asia and South China Sea. In East Asia, Northeast Asia, right now Japan is acting as claimant. So my question to you is that without having that historical colonial context, how can we compare with the Japanese experience? And you mentioned about the three principles and how the remarks, the wide open to dialogue can be implemented. I believe that without having a serious acknowledgement of the historical context during the countries involved in that area, I personally believe that the outcome should be very limited. So thank you.
Thank you. Please, Professor Togo, it's a question for you.
May I combine my answer with a comment to Professor Wong?
Of course, please do it. It would be more interesting.
Well, so thank you very much for the question. I just wanted to combine my response with my comment to what Professor Wong mentioned about Abe. It's about ultra-nationalist tendency. So play up the China threat after he gained power last year. China threat is real in Japan. But in order to cope with this newly emerging situation, there is an absolute need, I think, in my view, for deterrence and dialogue. Deterrence is taken care by our defense people. Dialogue is taken care by our diplomats. And now there is a need for Japan to go both. But in terms of diplomacy, I am convinced that the foreign ministry should mobilize the remaining part of its energy to enhance dialogue. And if that is giving an impression that Japan is becoming more militant against China, I am very sorry for amateurish way. Because, but this is the first time in whole post-war area where we have put in a situation where failure of diplomacy could lead into something very serious. And I'm afraid to say that post-war Japanese diplomats are not used to it. And the way probably Abe is behaving is very amateurish. The impression which we have to create is our willingness to talk to the Chinese and overcome that present difficulty through dialogue, not an impression to create or play up the China threat. But at the same time, if that problem is so clear, then there is a need in Japan to consolidate our relations, improve relations with the neighboring countries. And that includes the United States, Korea, Russia, and ASEAN. This is not to mean that we are trying to encircle China. Not at all. At least in my view, not at all. But there is an inherent necessity for Japan to improve relations with all neighboring countries. Now, Korea included. Korea included. And in that sense, among the countries which I have mentioned, present day of the situation between Japan and Korea is simply devastating. The bad atmospheric which surrounds it, really awful. Has to do something about it. Now coming to your question. Naturally, I think I am taking into consideration the history. I have no intention to escape from the history. But the post-war reality is that out of this history emerged status quo power. And status quo power meaning a country which has actual control of the territory, and the country which is objecting to it. In case of Takeshima Doctor, status quo from 1954 onwards became Korea. And Japan is not in agreement with this Korean position, but throughout the whole post-war history, the way Japan tried to express our view was peaceful. And as I mentioned, Japan has never put Takeshima Doctor issue at the centrality of relationship with Korea. When I was a diplomat, I hesitated to say so. But I dealt with the Northern Territorial issues myself, and the extent of energy and the zeal with which we try to change the state in real status quo, in a way we have dealt with Takeshima Doctor, entirely different. And one of the reasons why it was different clearly emanates from our recollection of our colonial history. But you know, this doesn't mean that Japan's position on this is immediately gone. So my recipe in relation to Korea is to find a way to honor Korean feeling on this issue, but a way to coexist on this issue between Japan and Korea. And in my personal experience with all my Korean friends, I am convinced that if there's a willingness on both sides, we can do it. But at this point in time, our psychological situation is so bad that it is very difficult even to talk about it. And I simply regret about it. Thank you very much.
Can I just have a very quick intervention in response to Professor Togo's comments regarding my presentation? I think the question of a part of the question really is how this status quo is to be defined in terms of the Diaoyu Island disputes, and does that status quo definition of status quo include a Chinese recognition of a Japanese administration of Diaoyu Island? I would say, of course not. This is very important because I think the Japanese position, and by extension, the American position is that Japan administrates the Diaoyu Island really sort of stems from the 1951 San Francisco Treaty, and then later on the 1972 agreement between Japan and the United States. And I think neither Chinese mainland nor Taiwan was signatory of the San Francisco Treaty. You know, we are not against every part of that. So I think our Russian colleagues can rest assured we are only against the part, the arrangement that concerning China's territory. We strongly reserve our position on that. And then 1972, when Japan and the United States signed that agreement to so-called to transfer the administration right from the United States to Japan, we strongly protested because the Chinese perspective that how does the United States have the right to transfer the administration of a Chinese territory? Therefore, it's very important to remember from the very beginning, China never recognized Japanese administration of the Diaoyu Island. And for this, can you imagine that Premier Zhou Enlai would said to Prime Minister Tanaka, let's shelve the disputes, and by the way, we recognize your administration of the Diaoyu Island? Of course not. So I think this is something we really have to be sort of bear in mind when we sort of try to think through this whole dispute. And of course, I agree that some sort of deliberate degree of ambiguity was kept, sort of to maintain the status quo. However, that ambiguity, I think, has been challenged from time to time throughout, I think, since 1979. So a lot of things happens And China responded, I think, strongly to a number of the incidences which China perception were perceived as Japan's attempt to shift the status quo to its own favor. That's why, yeah, I will just stop here. So I think a new level of ambiguity might be needed. You know, I do have this idea of one island, different interpretations, but because of time limit, I would.
It's a very vivid discussion, and of course, probably more questions for, please, the last row. Yeah. Is this question concerned not to China?
Tôi có một cái bình luận ngắn và có 2 câu hỏi. Thật ra thì không phải lần đầu tiên mà chúng tôi nghe lãnh đạo Trung Quốc nói rằng là người ta muốn thân thiện, muốn hữu nghị hữu hảo với láng giềng. Ít ra tôi cũng được nghe 30 lần rồi. Thế rồi việc đâu vẫn vào đấy. Và cái lòng tin của thế giới đối với Trung Quốc cũng càng ngày càng giảm. Trên thế giới cần lãnh đạo Trung Quốc hành động, chứ không cần nói thêm gì nữa cả. Đây là bình luận thứ nhất. 2 câu hỏi. Xin hỏi các bạn Trung Quốc, cái cơ sở pháp lý nào mà Trung Quốc vẫn đưa yêu sách quyền chủ quyền tài phán quốc gia đối với vùng nước trong đường lưỡi bò? Câu hỏi thứ 2 là các bạn đưa ra một câu rất đẹp, một cái chủ trương mà rất hợp với lòng mọi người, là gác tranh chấp cùng khai thác. Nhưng xin hỏi quý vị là gác tranh chấp cùng khai thác ở chỗ nào? Cái quan trọng chúng tôi cần biết gác tranh chấp cùng khai thác ở chỗ nào. Ví dụ như nhà tôi có một cái vườn, có cái nhà có sổ đỏ, mà tự nhiên nhà bên cạnh lại cho người sang để mà hái xoài, để mà bắt cá, thì cái điều này không thể gác tranh chấp cùng khai thác được. Đây xin có 2 câu hỏi đối với các bạn Trung Quốc. Hết rồi.
Thank you for the question, but I think it's not enough time to go in details in this interesting dispute. But probably you could reply personally after that. Yeah. If our participants want to detail anything. Yes. Let's give the turn to our Indian colleague.
The whole day one has been listening to ideas, suggestions about conflict resolution, solving the thing. I think the basic point that gets, they are very noble objectives, but then one has to be realistic. And I think what the Vietnamese Prime Minister said at the last Shangri-La dialogue was that the problem is of lack of strategic trust. Now, can we say in this entire Asia Pacific, amongst the contending powers or amongst the parties that are at dispute, is there strategic trust? Whether it be in China and Vietnam, or China and Japan, or China and India. And the next question is, who has to assist the process of creating trust? I think the answer is obvious. I thought I must make this intervention because otherwise we meet at such conferences and talk about resolutions and suggestions, and it doesn't make sense. We cannot push issues under the carpet. Thank you.
Thank you. And on this occasion, let me ask you, Dr. Kapila, you stated that India should emerge as a strategic regional balancer and could not remain a detached observer. Of course, it is a process, but how you appreciate, is it in progress?
India's interest, one has spelled out very briefly in my speech today, but it's contained in my papers. It's a question of ASEAN's expectation and United States' expectation. The United States has publicly stated at various forums in Southeast Asia, in the ASEAN region, that they expect India to be a net provider of security in the region. As far as readiness of India is concerned, I would only quote the Indian Prime Minister's statement made very recently in relation to the Indian Ocean region, and he stated that India is well positioned to provide that and also in extended areas. As far as the ASEAN expectation is concerned, of course, there are various interpretations of the regional balancer. Some in Singapore, some academics suggested it should be a soft balancer, but balancing should not be taken only in military terms. You also have what one could call in the balance of power, the existential provision of balance of power. That in today's Asian power balance, which I made the point, is a power between a multipolar thing between India, Japan and China. And therefore, when you see that sort of question is, between the three, who are more amenable to cooperation? And I think that the answer is obvious. It is between India and Japan, who have striven to make the defense cooperation, strategic dialogues more open. And I would even say your own country, this last meeting that you had in Tokyo, the format of 2+2, despite your despite your differences in perceptions over the territorial dispute, both Russia and Japan felt it is important at this stage to have this 2+2 meetings, including that next year you would also explore the possibilities of more defense cooperation, including cyber security. So therefore, you said one more point about the South China Sea. I didn't have paucity of time. India has, if some of you may recall, Indian Naval Chief's statement about 2 years back. Of course, the government muted that if called upon, the Indian Navy is ready for any role there. But of course, when the question which I was expecting did not come from the audience, and maybe it's your thing is pointing in that direction, as to what India would do in the event of a contingency in the South China Sea. My short answer to that would be that ASEAN itself would not expect a stand-alone response from India. If that contingency, that critical contingency is reached, then it is the international community which would have to find solutions and act. And I don't think, from my own personal assessment, I think India would go along with the international community and not hold back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapila. That's all things, I think, for this section. I would like to express my thanks to all participants for this interesting discussion, and to thank also the audience. And let's pause a little bit before the next section. Thank you very much.